All right, so former President Donald J. Trump just cannot stop getting indicted. This is now the third indictment that we have seen over the last couple of months. Obviously, we had the Stormy Daniels indictment for the hush money payments that he made to her. We also had the classified documents indictment that was also leveled against him. And now we have the indictment over the 2020 election and his actions leading up to January 6th. So here just the basic outline before we get into the actual details of the indictment. From BNO News, they say Trump could face maximum of 55 years in prison if convicted on all charges in the January 6th case. So, I mean, just right off the bat, I'm going to be honest with you guys, he's not going to get 55 years in prison. I mean, the man is not going to be alive for the next 55 years, first and foremost, but he's most likely, not actually going to be imprisoned for some substantial period of time in this case. But nonetheless, it seems like this is a pretty tough one for him to be facing right now, and certainly could result in some action taken against him. So here's the basics. They say there's conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction to an official proceeding, and then conspiracy against rights. In this one, it's specifically referring to like civil rights, and basically saying that because Donald Trump tried to come up with this alternative slate of electors to be approved while they were counting the electoral college votes, and Mike Pence was doing that on January 6th, and that ceremony, that procedural thing that was going on before the insurrection, and basically because of his efforts to send that fake slate of electors, he somehow violated people's civil rights and the ability for them to have their votes counted. So that was just one aspect of it. But to get into a little bit more details here from CBS News, they actually give us the entire indictment, which I will link down below if you want to go read through the 45 pages of it. But I just want to highlight for you guys here the first couple ones to get a general view in terms of what is actually being alleged here and potentially how strong this case actually is. So they say indictment. The grand jury charges that at all times material to this indictment on or about the dates and the approximate times stated below. Number one, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, was the 45th president of the United States and a candidate for re-election in 2020. The defendant lost the 2020 presidential election. Easy enough so far. Number two, despite having lost, the defendant was determined to remain in power. So for more than 2 months following Election Day on November 3rd, 2020, the defendant spread lies that there had been an outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won. And so the reason they're emphasizing obviously this outcome determinative fraud as opposed to just like alleging general fraud within the 2020 election is because, of course, that is what's actually pertinent to the claims that Donald Trump was alleging, right? He wasn't saying like, okay, there were a couple or maybe a dozen or so cases where people actually committed election fraud and like voted when they shouldn't have, or voted twice or something like that. That's not what Trump was claiming. He was claiming there was such widespread fraud within the 2020 election that it was enough to overturn it from being a Joe Biden victory to being a Trump victory, right? So that's the specification of what they're actually saying there. They say these claims were false. Yeah, no shit. And the defendant knew that they were false, which is also important in this instance. And how do we know that it was false? Well, because he was basically admitting that behind the scenes, as were other people who were working with him to try to overturn the election, that they were also admitting that they kind of knew that they were bullshitting. But they say the defendant repeated and widely disseminated them anyway to make his knowingly false claims appear legitimate, create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and erode public faith in the administration of the election. Number three, the defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to claim falsely that there had been outcome determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. So this is another really important part of this, right? Because as we're going to get to here in a minute, a lot of Republicans, including Donald Trump himself, are basically trying to say this is a free speech case, right? How are you going to go and arrest somebody because they think that there was fraud in an election, right? That is not what is being outlined here. I mean, this is literally page 2 of this indictment, right? And they say very clearly that he, Donald Trump, like every American, had the right to even falsely claim, and to exercise his First Amendment right to say that the election had somehow been stolen from him. That's not what the actual indictment here is really about. It's actually more so about the actions that Donald Trump took in order to try to obstruct the process of the peaceful transfer of power, right? It's less about, he was going out there and spreading lies. Okay, that's probably true. That's 100% true. But at the same time, that's not actually what the core part of the indictment is here. They say he was also entitled to formally challenge the results of the election through lawful and appropriate means, such as by seeking recounts or audits of the popular vote in states or filing lawsuits challenging ballots and procedures. Indeed, in many cases, the defendant did pursue these methods of contesting the election results. His efforts to change the outcome in any state through recounts, audits, or legal challenges were uniformly successful. I mean, just an absolutely atrocious track record that Donald Trump and his legal team had here. They finish off here saying, they say, shortly after the election day, the defendant also pursued unlawful means to discount legitimate votes and subverting the election results. In doing so, the defendant perpetuated 3 criminal conspiracies. And basically, it's like, obstruction of the official proceedings of the certification of the 2020 election and thereby violating people's rights. Okay, so then they get into more details in terms of each individual count, and they go into totally excruciating detail here about exactly what Trump and his legal team were saying at the time, what they knew, how what they were saying was contradictory to what they actually knew behind the scenes, using these methods that a bunch of other legal counsels were telling them were absolutely wild and insane and couldn't possibly be legal or justified, and they continued to do it, which obviously led up to January 6th. Now, a couple other things that I wanted to point out here real quick. We had Jack Smith, who's obviously the leading prosecutor in this case. We had a direct quote from him. He said, "The attack on our nation's capital on January 6th was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy, and it was fueled by lies." And importantly here, he said, the department's investigation of other individuals continues, right? And so why I think this is important is because basically throughout this entire outline that they gave here, throughout this entire indictment, they list a bunch of co-conspirators. I think it's about 6 of them, right? They end off here, co-conspirators 6, 5, 4, etc., right? These conspirators were a part of sort of this gang that was surrounding Trump that was trying to formulate this plan to get those fake electors, to try to get Pence to interfere on January 6th from the counting of the Electoral College votes. All of these co-conspirators could now be people who potentially are being put in an awkward position where they have to either face jail time themselves or to turn against Donald Trump and actually offer evidence that could bolster the case against him. So they are basically leaving that open, that they could try to pursue legal cases against these co-conspirators. We don't know the exact details of that right now, but again, it's not very good news for Donald Trump, because you could have people who were in the room with him at the time who were helping to, formulate these kinds of tactics that were used to try to overturn the election, and basically, again, they could turn against him, and that's going to make the situation that much worse. But they finish off here, of course, with a little bit of Trump grifting, because obviously he's a businessman. The guy is not going to miss out on an opportunity to try to skim some money off of his supporters, right? They say the Trump campaign capitalized on his 3rd indictment by sending out an email advertising for a limited edition "I Stand with Trump" t-shirt that features Tuesday's date on it. Okay, so we got the indictment t-shirts flying off the shelves, and of course this is going to go directly essentially to his legal funds. We had some recent reporting that came out showing that apparently $60 million or so has been dumped out of his super PACs into his legal funds to try to pay for all of these indictments and the defenses for these indictments that Trump has been facing recently. So I mean, listen, if you are somebody who is giving money to Donald Trump, this is what it's going towards. I mean, maybe a lot of people who are giving money to Trump understand that and they don't really care, or they support this money being used for his defense or something like that, but otherwise it seems like you're kind of just getting shafted in that equation. Now, a couple other things that I wanted to point out here, as stated from Politico. The judge who is apparently going to be overseeing this case is very tough, and has been tough historically through the last couple of years and such as been very tough on January 6 people who were in the crowd at the time, who were trying to storm the Capitol, and so has actually been dishing out like sentences that are even harsher than what was asked for from the prosecution. So that should be interesting. I mean, that's the person who's going to be overseeing this. So again, not great news for the former president here. And a couple other pieces that were within the official indictment that I wanted to just mention to you guys here. It's pointed out by John Favreau. He says the plan was to stage a coup and then use the military to put down any protest that ensued. And so this is straight from the document. They say on the afternoon of January 3rd, just a couple days before the riot, co-conspirator number 4 spoke with a deputy White House counsel. The previous month, the deputy White House counsel had informed the defendant that, quote, "There is is no world, there is no option in which you do not leave the White House on January 20th. Now, the same deputy White House counsel tried to dissuade co-conspirator 4 from assuming the role of acting attorney general. The deputy White House counsel reiterated to co-conspirator 4 that there had not been outcome determinative fraud in the election, and that if the defendant remained in office nonetheless, there would be riots in every major city in the United States. And co-conspirator 4 responded, well, that's why there's an Insurrection Act. Okay, so again, as pointed out here by John, basically insinuating that, like, yeah, we know that we're not legally allowed to do this, but we're going to do it anyways. And then if there is some sort of a Democratic pushback or people take to the streets to prevent us from stealing the election, we are going to, deploy our shock troops to go out and try to put the protesters down by weaponizing the Insurrection Act. So fucking insane kind of stuff that we're talking about here, right? But another quote that I thought was interesting from this indictment, they say here from Shane Goldmacher, with respect to the persistent false claim regarding State Farm Arena from my home state of Atlanta, Georgia, on December 8th, the senior campaign advisor wrote in an email, quote, when our research and campaign legal team can't back up any of the claims made by our elite strike force legal team, you can see why we are 0-32 on our cases. I'll obviously hustle to help on all fronts, but it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership. Conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership. And the mothership in this instance would be, I guess, Donald Trump himself, right? But I mean, first off, Elite Strike Force Legal Team, I mean, that name in and of itself should be enough to get Trump locked behind bars. I mean, that's what you called it, Elite Strike Force Legal Team. And then on top of that, you're 0-32 in your cases so far. I mean, these are the kinds of things that were being said behind the scenes, right? 0-32. I don't know if you guys are into sports or anything like that, but if your team in any context is ever down 0-32 in the season, it might be time to like pack it up and start a new sport or something like that, right? 0-32, and on top of that, you're naming your team the Elite Strike Force Legal Team, right? I mean, just bound for failure there. One other thing that stood out here is pointed out by Sungmin Kim. She says, indictment, Trump told Pence, you're too honest, when the VP objected to blocking Biden win. Okay, you're too honest, right? Famously, always a problem. And now we get to the big man himself, Donald Trump, and his official campaign response to this indictment. So this is amazing. They say, quote, this is nothing more than the latest corrupt chapter in the continued pathetic attempt by the Biden crime family and their weaponized Department of Justice to interfere with the 2024 presidential election, in which President Trump is the undisputed frontrunner and leading by substantial margins. Okay, first of all, Biden, is he corrupt? Yes, massively. Hunter Biden, is he corrupt? Yes, massively. We all know that. That's no surprise, obviously. But the idea that like this is the Joe Biden crime family personally deciding that you should be, thrown in jail because of your political opinions. No, it's not that. These are your own actions coming to bite you in the ass, right? I mean, there is nobody to blame in this situation but yourself. But they say, why did they wait 2.5 years to bring these fake charges right in the middle of President Trump's winning campaign for 2024? Why was it announced the day after the big crooked Joe Biden scandal broke out from the halls of Congress? So he's referring to this recent testimony from this guy, Devin Archer, who was one of Hunter Biden's previous business partners, and they were pointing out that and basically emphasizing Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's potential alleged corruption relating to like Burisma and all of those other allegations. But I mean, President Trump's winning campaign in 2024, why did they wait 2.5 years to bring this case? I honestly think that's a fair question. I don't think it's because it's like politically motivated necessarily, but I just think like maybe the DOJ is ineffective and bloated and not actually that great at their jobs. And I don't know why they took this long to actually bring this case. I think the best moment to do it would have been like as close to January 6th and the events that unfolded after the 2020 election as possible, but this is how long it took. He continues, he says the answer is it's because of election interference. Okay, so the election interference is when you hold somebody accountable for trying to overturn the results of a valid election, right? That's the interference, not the trying to overturn the election in and of itself. That's not election interference. It's election interference when people try to hold you accountable for your actions, right? They say the lawlessness of these persecutions of President Trump and his supporters is reminiscent of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Reminiscent of Nazi Germany. The former Soviet Union and other authoritarian dictatorial regimes. No, I would make actually the complete inverse of that case, meaning if you have elite corrupt politicians who violate the law and you don't persecute them, that is reminiscent of authoritarianism. That is reminiscent of dictatorial regimes where there is a actual, like, two different classes of people within the country, one who the law applies to and one who the law does not apply to. The actual, base thing to do in this situation is to prosecute you if you actually violate the law, regardless of if you're the president or if you are a member of Congress or if you are some other wealthy person within the United States of America. It should be the same across the board. But he obviously disagrees with that, right? He thinks it's actually dictatorial for, previous presidents to be held accountable for their crimes, right? He says, President Trump has always followed the law and the Constitution. Doubt it. With advice from many highly accomplished lawyers. Again, doubt it. These un-American witch hunts will fail, and President Trump will be reelected to the White House so he can save our country from the abuse, incompetence, and corruption that is running through the veins of our country at levels never seen before. 3 years ago, we had strong borders, energy independence, no inflation, and a great economy. Okay, so he just starts riffing there, I guess. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually Trump who typed this up in the third person, but that was his, their response, the campaign's official response to this indictment. And then we also have, of course, the cuck Ron DeSantis, Rob, as Trump calls him, who also gave a response here defending Donald Trump. He says, as president, I will end the weaponization of government, replace the FBI director, and ensure a single standard of justice for all Americans. So, I mean, if you were just to take this completely out of context and remove the fact that it was said by Ron DeSantis, this sentence I would not object to, right? I don't want a weaponization of government. I would love to, replace the FBI with something that was actually more functional and wasn't just targeting, different groups within the United States unfairly, and ensure a single standard of justice for all Americans. Sure, I would love that as well. But here's the conflation that Republicans want to push forward, right? They want to claim that there is a two-tiered system of justice, and what they mean is that Democrats get away with everything, Republicans get persecuted for everything. There is a two-tiered system of justice in this country, but it's not along partisan lines. It's along, class lines in this country. If you are wealthy, if you are a billionaire, if you are a member of Congress, right? If you are somebody in elite society in the United States, you are the person who is guarded from a lot of the same laws that would otherwise apply to people who are actually like working class folks here in the United States, right? That's the two-tiered system of justice. But Republicans are basically just trying to say, like, you're going after our guy, and so there's a two-tiered system of justice where it's Democrats versus Republicans. No, I mean, it's completely ridiculous, right? So they say, while I've seen reports, I have not read the indictment. I do, though, believe that we need to enact reforms so that Americans have the right to remove cases from Washington, D.C. to their home districts. He says Washington, D.C. is a swamp, and it's unfair to have to stand trial before a jury that is reflective of the swamp mentality. So everybody who lives in Washington, D.C., I guess, including myself, now that I live in Washington, D.C., we're all just swamp creatures and shouldn't be allowed to be on juries, I guess. Okay, so he continues. He says, one of the reasons our country is in decline is the polarization or the politicization of the rule of law. No more excuses. I will end the weaponization of the federal government, okay? He says, one of the reasons our country is in decline is the politicization of the rule of law. This is the same guy who is trying to sue Bud Light in the state of Florida because they ran one single Instagram ad with a trans woman, okay? That guy is now complaining about the politicization of the rule of law. Okay, Ronnie boy. Now, a couple other things that are just arguments that, again, I think are extremely weak. Kind of mentioned this earlier in the video, but as pointed out here by a friend of the show, Secular Talk, Kyle Kalinske, and also not friend of the show, Marco Rubio. He says, apparently, it is now a crime to make statements challenging election results if the prosecutor decides that those statements aren't true. And as Kyle points out here, this is a lie. And I just read this to you guys. The indictment explicitly says the opposite of this on page 2, denying the election is fine. Even bringing a bunch of lawsuits against it is fine. What is illegal is the fake electors slate, fraudulent documents, and an attempt to disenfranchise millions of voters and steal an election. And he is 100% correct about that. We also had Mike Pence, who chirped in here and gave his position on it a little bit more, on the hard line than guys like Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio. He says, Sadly, the president was surrounded by a group of crackpot lawyers that kept telling him what his itching ears wanted to hear. The president ultimately continued to demand that I choose him over the Constitution. So yeah, I mean, he's not necessarily wrong there, but at the same time, people might forget that this man is actually running for president right now. He's polling at about 2%. Donald Trump is obviously dominating in the polls, even with all of these indictments. In fact, it seems like the more that he gets indicted, the better that he does in the Republican primary. Now, it may be different in a general election, assuming that he's not in jail and he runs against Joe Biden. These things might actually hurt him a little bit more in the general election. But at this point, if you look at the polling data, it's basically just a coin flip as to whether or not we are going to get a guy who is, obviously a horrible president, a horrible person, and now has been indicted 3 times. And somehow Democrats can't muster up any better counter to that than somebody like Joe Biden, who is also just abysmally, corrupt and dysfunctional and incompetent and, all of those things as well. So, I mean, at this point, it's honestly just embarrassing that it has taken this long for some sort of like an action to be, actually put forward in response to somebody trying to overturn a Democratic election. But here we go. It's going to be interesting over the next couple of weeks, obviously seeing Donald Trump get his day in court and seeing how his supporters respond to this entire thing. Definitely going to be interesting. And I will keep you guys updated as we get more developments.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying